So hi everyone, thank you for coming and attending this panel session about AI in pharma. So we're gonna try something a little bit different from other panels. I'm gonna try to make this as interactive as possible so that it gives you a chance to ask questions or comment on our responses. So we would like to make this as interactive as you like. Unfortunately, there are no mics around, so you'll just have to raise your hand, speak loudly, we'll repeat the question, and we'll comment on it. So without further ado, I'm going to start with introductions. So each of the panelists will talk about who they are, the company that they work for, what the company does, and our role. So I'm Irene Pack, and I work for Bristol Squibb, and we're a biopharma company developing drugs for patients. I've been in the pharma industry for 20 years, and I'm very passionate about data and science in general. My current role is to bring AI to life in the clinical development space. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Chaitanya.
Hi everyone, is this working? Good. Chaitanya Badwe here. I'm a director of client engagement and strategy at Analytical Wizards, which is a definitive healthcare company. I work sort of at the overlap of strategy for biopharmaceuticals and also providing sort of the analytics needs across the life cycle of any drug. So, we provide both professional services as well as two platforms that we have. And following Irene's example, I think I am super passionate about getting sort of AI ML involved in the strategic side of pharma and facilitating sort of making sure it's expanded out and more scaled up than it is now.
Great, thanks, Chaitanya. My name's Sina Bari. I'm a plastic and reconstructive surgeon and director of medical AI at iMerit. iMerit is a data annotation company that works within healthcare to unlock all the insights in unstructured data. We bring together the tools and the expertise, and specifically with our pharma partners, we work on use cases such as digital radiology, digital pathology, real-world evidence, and patient engagement. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sina, Chaitanya, and Irene. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for your interest in our panel and joining us today. My name is Subha Madhavan. I am the head of clinical AI ML in worldwide R&D at Pfizer. Really thrilled to be working for a company which has now become a household name, especially after the COVID vaccine and also the anti-infective Paxlovid. My remit is, as I said, I work in R&D, so my remit is really from preclinical all the way through to phase 2 studies, and we're looking for opportunities to apply AI and ML in that space, particularly to bring precision medicine in terms of identifying patient subpopulations that will respond to certain types of treatment, and also identifying patient populations that might develop resistance to certain types of treatment and so on. We work on a number of therapy areas, including oncology, immunology, and inflammation, rare diseases, cardiovascular, and others, and really delighted to be here among my other esteemed panelists. Back to you, Irene.
Great. So I think we all agree that AI is going to transform every industry, and we've heard some really good use cases already in the two-day event here. In pharma, every stage in our drug development pipeline, I think AI can be used. So through early discovery to clinical research to commercialization, manufacturing, what have you. And I think for me, what I see the AI impact here in the pharma industry is in a local setting, I'm already seeing a lot of solutions already helping scientists, helping our workforce be more productive, automating some of the mundane tasks that's really difficult to do with just rule-based approaches and some of the pure automation approaches. And in a global setting, I think all of us just recently experienced this with AI really changing the paradigm of how drugs are being developed with the COVID vaccine. It typically takes many years to get a vaccine to market, and just look at how fast we were able to get the vaccine onto the market in the last 2 years. So with that, I think for me, we're definitely anticipate a lot more that AI can do for the pharma industry. I want to open it up to other panelists. What are your thoughts about AI impact in the industry?
Happy to jump in here. So, again, as I said, we work across the spectrum of the life cycle of a drug, right? So, one area that I think is really key where AI/ML can really help the pharma industry is on the commercialization side, where we have a few sort of things that we basically identify patients, especially in the rare disease space. Pharma is all about betterment of life for patients, right? In the rare disease, we know for a fact that you may have the cures out there, but depending on the intensity of the disease, patients don't get access to this. This may be because of not knowing about the drugs that are available, access issues, compliance. All of these are use cases where, with the right cues and the right support structure, patients should and will, I hope in the future, get access to better medications and faster access to medications.
It's interesting. I mean, you brought up COVID. I think one story that we've learned is the amazing work that's come out of Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies in drug development. But most of us, I think, when we think about COVID, we really think about it as a failure of the traditional healthcare system. Even I think the CDC sent out an apology yesterday for the struggles that they've had in communicating. And that's because, we have a system that's under strain, and then we had an event that put even more strain to the point of breaking. And it pointed out where the real breaking points are. If I see a patient in my clinic who has, I suspect has measles, I have to catch those symptoms. I have to call, my local reporting board. That's how disease tracking happens today. In the future, there will be, NLP models that scan through charts looking for symptomatology so that we can approach, the next pandemic, I think in a lot of ways we'll be looking back at this pandemic as sort of the pre-AI pandemic, and future, hopefully what the tools we'll have in the future will enable us to approach infectious disease and in both on the treatment side and the tracking side a lot better.
So I think just to quickly build on Sina's COVID use case, right? So I think there is tremendous opportunity in front of us because there is all kinds of amazing data that we're collecting, especially now with COVID. There is so much real-world data, right, from hospitals, and there's also clinical trials that companies like Pfizer and others have run. And then there is tremendous amount of understanding of what data we need to collect to understand the immune system within the host cells, right? So there is a lot of molecular data that's coming together. So I think as a community, if we think about how do we integrate these multivariate, multifaceted data sets to build models that can help us build the next generation of therapeutics, right? So what does next generation Paxlovid look like? Long COVID is real, right? So I had COVID in January, and I still feel like I've not completely gotten over the symptoms of fatigue, for example, right? So there was recently, a couple weeks ago, a publication about what are the different subtypes of long COVID. There are neuromuscular disorders, respiratory disorders that are very long term. So the question is, can we address them with some of the newer therapeutics? And the only way to do that is by bringing together these multivariate, multifaceted, multimodal data sets together to build models that can inform us. So I'm super excited about that. I think you asked Irene about impact. I think the late stages, and we talked about this in our pre-panel discussion, Late stage and commercial, very, very important to apply AI, because there the question is more, how can I scale up and how can I automate and how can I improve efficiencies? But we can tell better stories by applying AI in the early phases within R&D. So that's what I'm really excited about. I think we didn't have this opportunity even 5 or 6 years ago in terms of collecting well-labeled data sets across these multimodalities. But now we're starting to collect that. And the question is, how can we use them to really inform the next generation of therapeutics?
Yeah, so that's actually a good point to segue into what do you see coming next, especially now that we have a lot more data than we had before. Some usable, some not usable, but if we imagine a world of very usable data, where would innovation take us?
Great. So I think with innovation, again, as Subha mentioned, AI has the potential to plug into each and every aspect of the life cycle, right? Whether it be preclinical when you're designing drugs, whether it's at the tail end when you're optimizing the compliance for patients. Sort of these are use cases where sort of I see AI really plugging in at a larger scale. And piggybacking off the COVID question, so the first thing when you mentioned that, the first thought in my mind is, oh my God, it's going to be a pain to identify these patients because the patients themselves don't know they are suffering from a specific type of long COVID. In the future, if AI is being implemented early on to identify specific personalized medicine for these patients, it should automatically follow that when the commercialization stage comes, there should be an AI model that is identifying these patients beforehand, right? So even if the patient doesn't know that, okay, I have this specific variant of long COVID for which there is a treatment available, the physician should have sort of the means available to talk to the patient and be like, okay, this is, I just had a discussion with the Pharma, one of the field teams, and they said that this is a new treatment that has come out, and I think your symptoms sort of match up, and I know we've been trying to treat this for a year, and this, let's try it out. The sooner this happens, the sooner the patients are going to get the relief. And so, you know, along the life cycle, as I said, there's places where AI will plug in.
Yeah, I think this point about just diagnosis in general, there's a talk yesterday by Dr. Stephen Wong that talks about misdiagnosis is costly to the patient. And even for, I don't want to call it a simple like stroke example, but stroke, we kind of know the symptoms, but you'll be surprised how much misdiagnosing is out there. And he demonstrated a very good use of AI to help, and right now is in the clinical setting. So yeah, anything else about innovation, where we're headed, what's coming?
Yeah, I think Chaitanya spoke to it really well. It is precision medicine, and that really is the ultimate goal. And it comes from unlocking the big data challenge that every physician faces. You know, every moment in time, each patient, between omics data, between imaging, they themselves in a single point in time, let alone longitudinally, present a big data challenge. And so AI is really just a tool to unlock that. I'm sorry, Subha was saying, from a multivariate standpoint.
Yeah, I guess to quickly add, in terms of innovation, I mean, one of the things we're tracking is this whole concept of digital twins, right? So do people know what digital twins are? Can you show of hands? Yeah, I see a couple here. The concept is actually very simple. It was made popular in the manufacturing industry. The airline industry used it quite a bit to actually create digital twins of engine parts so that they could actually test and do quality control on these digital twin engine parts before they could actually test it on the real production version. So if you sort of extrapolate that concept, it's becoming more and more popular in the oncology space, right? So the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, and the Department of Energy had a think tank a couple of years ago, and there was this whole program. So if you search up NCI, DOE, digital twins, you'll pull up a lot of publications. There were actually a couple of them published in Nature journal, and the concept is, can we actually create computer versions of cancer patients so that you could ask these what-if questions on the computer before you see the patient? And I think this goes back to the use case that you were talking about, Chaitanya, which is, even before it happens, can we be ahead of the game, right? So it's almost like a chess game where you anticipate the moves of the cancer cells, and then, what is the right therapy that this patient is going to need 3 months down the road. And so you can ask those what-if questions in this population of digital twins. And I think that concept is starting to catch on in biopharma just in general and in other therapy areas. One thing I always hear about from my operational leaders is we want to reduce the number of patients and we want to reduce the cost of clinical trials. So the question is, can we have the synthetic population, at least for the placebo arms, for example, right? And of course, there is a lot of regulatory concerns, and we'd have to talk with the regulatory agencies and get their inputs on this. But that is something that I'm definitely bullish about. Is let's test out and ask these what-if questions, not in people, but actually in the computer models of patients, which would be this sort of multi-scale buildup of every individual from the molecular scale to the population level.
Yeah, and I also want to make a point about, so in other talks, we learn how important knowing the business problem that you're solving for, that's number one question that you have to answer. But once you have that figured out, some of the challenges that we have is with the data. With the data, so much data, but not everything's usable. Where innovation I see would help unlock the sort of the challenge that we face, spending 80% of the time maybe harmonizing data, cleaning, curating. I think the speaker from Sabanova yesterday was talking about using GPT, and how many of you have actually seen GPT working? It's pretty amazing of what it can do. So he was alluding to GPT being able to start maybe harmonizing unstructured data with structured data, so that the amount of data that can potentially be machine ready is, I think that itself, maybe it's not tied specifically to the business problem, but once you have more and more data that is machine ready, then tying that to solve business problems, I think would be much easier. So it would flip the balance of the 80%. Now we're spending 80% of the time deriving insights, and then 20% of the time managing, curating, and massaging data. That would be, I think, also be a paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Irene. I think the elephant in the room is really data. Having labeled data helps you build good models, and really see a lot of innovation coming in that space with regards to, can we label data sets without human intervention, right? So can we automatically label data sets either through transfer learning or what we know about clinical trials? And if we actually think about it, the clinical trials, if you kind of follow, for example, I'm just going to take an example, the Paloma studies for, metastatic breast cancer, for CDK4/6 inhibitors, right, palbociclib. If you followed the iteration 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's maybe some added eligibility criteria every time, right? So there's actually a systematic process by which the pharma companies actually run these trials. So understanding that process can maybe help us label these data sets better without having that human intervention. I think definitely an area that begs for innovation, and I would even hedge my bet and say we're probably spending 90% of our time doing what we call data janitorial services and data processing services, and 10% building and interpreting models, and that definitely can use some rebalancing.
So we're in the I guess the janitorial services. That's our business. Surgeons are plumbers as well, so there's that overlap. But one of the things that we've tried to do is, one, recognize that within medicine there's a global fund of knowledge. The books that I train out of are the books that folks all over the world train out of. We read the same journals. So bringing in that global fund of knowledge, using sort of physician extenders, physician multipliers in the same way a busy clinic would be used, and then also bringing in and leveraging the experience we have across more mature industries, finance, automotive, agriculture, for things like data automation and pre-labeling has made a big difference to try and overcome that hurdle of unstructured data in a cost-effective way.
I actually want to piggyback off Subha's point on the trial, making trials more efficient, right? The way I see it, it's from two different angles. I think the one that you mentioned was obviously being more efficient with your recruitment so that every iteration of the trial is sort of better at identifying patients. And the second is obviously from the recruitment side, AI/ML should be able to take all the inputs on where trials are being run, where the patients are, and putting that all together so that any pharma company that's running a trial has the right tools to make sure it's run in sort of record time, right? Every subsequent model should be more efficient. And I know we're helping patients and everything, but with pharma, you have to make money at some point. So if the time for a trial is being reduced by 6 months, that's sort of 6 more months at peak revenue, right?
Yeah.
So
I think on the time aspect, if I may just comment, I think that what COVID has shown us is we don't need 18 years to develop a drug. We can, in fact, do it in a year and a half. So I think the regulatory agencies are also kind of pushing us to kind of shorten that time frame. This is the perfect sweet spot for automation and for AI and ML. Can we actually question the current processes that are taking this long for us to run these clinical trials and really disrupt the pipeline with AI/ML and shorten that time frame? We've shown it can be done. It's just a matter of how do you extrapolate it to other therapy areas.
That's perfect. On cue, a hand is raised.
I have a question about precision medicine, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. But I'm just wondering, with all of the initiatives and support, from the federal government about this area, we do have, as you know, the enabling technologies available for identifying biomarkers for certain a genetic sequence. We have companies that are running this genetic sequence publicly. Are you aware of a major initiative right now that's tying up all of this, I'm going to call silo programs, to make it really adopted, widespread to the public, where you have, let's say, a managed care organization that's into preventive medicine. So if you're a physician, you have a sequence, DNA information for your patient, and you have other information available to say electronic medical record system. So having that availability of this for your patient and being able to get that information and connect to your patient, that I think we need to talk about you being at risk for diabetes in the near future. I wonder if you know any major initiative right now by government or non-government organizations, especially managed care organizations on this.
Yeah, so the question is about precision medicine. So whether there are major initiative tying all the siloed programs with collecting genetic information about digital biomarker data that really bring precision medicine to life, especially by managed care organization. Is that the gist of the question? Yeah.
I can jump in real quick here. I mean, I don't think there is one fully interconnected, well-standardized data sets that's readily available, but there are sort of, pockets of information that are available, right? So if we take, for example, if you take cancer data, that's sort of my area of familiarity, so I'll start with that. There are government programs that started these large initiatives like the Cancer Genome Atlas Project, TCGA, and then follow up to that Cancer Genome Atlas project was something called CPTAC, a clinical proteomics cancer consortium, which used the same patient samples on whom the genomic sequencing was done in TCGA, but actually generated mass spec and proteomics data within the CPTAC program. So it takes some effort to put a data set together, but some of these data sets are emerging in the public domain in a pre-competitive space. Yesterday we heard some talks about the UK Biobank, right? And so you mentioned sort of a managed care. This is a national health system within the UK. What I think it is like 500,000 patients or so that have been collected, which is electronic medical records. And then now they're doing whole exome sequencing and whole genome sequencing on those patients as well. So that data is becoming available. So more and more of these government-funded data sets in a preclinical sense are becoming available. I would say that they're much more on the research side. So for example, if we take TCGA, if you really want to hone in on a certain therapy area, you may not find that data because it was all primary tumors untreated on whom the data sets are available. So there are these small sets of data sets. I mean, they're not really small. They are pretty large, but they are sort of niche areas, right? So you'd have cancer, and there's this human cell atlas or the immune atlas and so on that are now coming online. And then, of course, you can purchase data sets like the claims data and others, right? So Optum and IQVIA, Symphony, et cetera, can be purchased. And these are mostly healthcare utilization type data sets. Those are some that come to mind. I'll pass it on to others.
Yeah, so I have a slightly different thought process for how we get to the precision medicine space, right, where each patient is going to be treated separately. Again, we're going to have a snowball effect with this. It's most likely, at least from my perspective, oncology is sort of prime for it, right? We have huge data sets that are capturing at a gene level every patient's signature. But the way it would, for me, how it will start, it's going to be smaller and smaller cohorts within each of these oncology areas. And as we diversify and start using more AI/ML, there will be these connections that set up across tumor types. We already have basket trials. It may just be a small sort of 2% of the population that has a specific mutation, but the basket trial that has been set up basically identifies that in prostate cancer, it's mainly in breast cancer, but in prostate, 2% of patients will benefit from this, right? So it's going to go from sort of 100,000 patients down to 10,000 patients, and from 10,000 down to 5,000. So it's going to be a slow process, but I think with AI/ML, it's ultimately going to get to that stage where you have a tumor signature, you have all the inputs, and you will ultimately be able to pick that, okay, you are most likely going to get this disease in the future, so let's prepare for it. But as I said, right now we are at sort of small cohorts and pockets within tumors, and that's sort of the first step to going forward.
Yeah, I think definitely precision medicine is the goal of many of the pharma companies. And I think each of what you said triggered a thought in me. So with Chaitanya, you talked about the progression. So I was thinking of tying this to what we heard earlier with the facial recognition. We're definitely early in the stage of, we're trying to get there. We're doing something bit by bit. Not that I'm aware of any open initiative, but for at least at the company level, we're always thinking about precision medicine. We're trying to reduce the cohort eventually down to the individual level. We're not quite there yet, but that's our goal. And the more we learn about biology, eventually this is a biology problem. Knowing your genetic information and then tying maybe a treatment regimen based on your genetic information, that's the goal. That is precise and it works, no side effects. And that would really be, I think, the paradigm shift in addressing medicine, bringing medicine to patients. And then, Subha, you talked about, I lost my train of thought.
Actually, while you're catching up, what you said triggered a thought to me. My advice would be to start with the question, right? So don't, if we ask what data is out there, it's usually better answered when you have a very specific question. So if we said, non-small cell lung cancer patients, if you treat them with immune checkpoint inhibitors, which are now approved for frontline standard of care therapy, only about 40% of them respond. So if your question is, I want to understand why 60% do not respond to checkpoint inhibitors, people who actually have non-small cell lung cancers, then you can kind of use that question to drive the types of data sets you need to build a model to answer those questions. So I would say always start with the question and not say that, are there sort of well-integrated multi-scale data sets that are available, and then now I'm going to go and figure out what I can learn from that. I think, Google has the luxury of doing that, sort of just learning from data, right? Because they've got billions of data points, but I think in healthcare, you're better served if you start with the question and then go after the data sets. Sorry.
I remember now. So you talked about the purchase data set. That's actually from the company level, not open initiative, but at the company level, we're purchasing a lot of these kind of data sets. But what I know, not from the U.S. side, but the European side, there is a initiative called EHDEN, EHDEN, that I think it's open source. But a lot of these initiatives start with EHR data, collecting a lot of what's available. With EHDEN, I think their goal is to make it publicly available. Any
think
other
that's- yeah.
questions? So the question is the application of AI in the early phases of clinical trials.
Right. I think we're all trying to figure this out together, right? So let me just maybe give you some use cases. So when you go from preclinical studies to maybe phase 1 or phase 2 studies, the biggest question is, how do we select the patient population, right? So you're looking for sort of that sign of clinical activity, and you're trying to prove the clinical activity in a patient population. And so the question is, can we actually de-risk assets by building AI ML models that can predict in which patient population this treatment is going to be responsive, right? So you've got your preclinical data, you have good PK/PD models, you've got your tox models done. Can we actually take all that data, but also bring data from downstream, such as EHRs and real-world evidence data sets, to identify the patient population that we will harm the least and that would benefit the most from? So this is sort of in sort of generic terms, right? Also, I think it's an opportunity to guide the type of data that we want to generate, right? So in phase 1 studies, you could sort of say, can I generate this type of biomarker, for example, right? So to give you an example, HER2 gene expression for HER2 targeted therapies in breast cancers. So you might say, well, we need to collect H&E slides on every patient and measure this HER2 protein. You can kind of guide the study design and the types of information that we want to collect in patients in early stages. You don't have the luxury of doing that, because by the time you reach phase 3, the story is already told. You're going in for HER2 positive patients or HER2 negative patients, HR positive. You have your asset that you've tested. Here your goal is, how can I get the 400 patients onto my clinical trials? But in early stage, you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of thinking about what are the right patient populations. So that's sort of where our headspace is at the moment. I think we have enough data to begin to guide us. So that's one. I guess the second use case is, if you look at DeepMind, right? So DeepMind, Google's spin-off, which just put forward all the protein folding data for millions of proteins. They've just made it openly available. So speaking of open protein data, that's one of it, right? The question is, which of those millions of proteins are actually drug targets, right? So can we actually use all this data that we're talking about here and ask the question in sort of the early stages, which are the indications that these drugs would work the best, right? So I've got these 12,000 millions of proteins, but maybe only a handful of them, probably in the JAK pathway or one of the immune-related pathway, may be related to a certain type of immune disease that we're looking at. So can we make that connection between the protein targets, which are now open source available, structured data is available, and connect that to the patient level information and say, what might be the right indications? And can we actually bridge the gap between that early discovery data and late stage clinical? So those are a couple of use cases where my headspace is.
Yeah, and Subha, there was a use case in between there, which was actually looking at the H&Es, which, we really haven't seen take off to the extent that we speculate it could, which is digital pathology. And I think that's, speaks to some of the obstacles that we're facing, legacy systems and, the expertise. I think, increasingly, we'll see folks in medicine, pathologists, radiologists who are dual trained in ML. I think some of that needs to happen for there to be synergy, especially in the clinical use cases.
Yeah, I can think of a couple other use cases, but I think in the early phases, we're struggling with not a whole lot of data. And you are also trying to tackle the translation problem, going from preclinical to clinical. And some of the objective in the early phases also safety profile, make sure the drug is safe, as well as dose finding. And those are all based on just what you know, how the animal responded, and you want to project into what the human would respond to as well. So that, I think, the data we don't have a lot of data to go from preclinical to clinical in the early phase when you're just targeting a handful of patients.
I think, I know we have a couple of minutes left, but I think one of the things that probably surprises me most about, our space right now is, 5 years ago, we spent a lot of time worrying about, patient adoption and apprehension by the patients, and we're not seeing that as much. I feel like the thing that's surprising me is when we look at things that are patient-facing, patient monitoring and engagement and voice RPA, phone systems, things like that. There isn't a resistance that I think a lot of us feared there would be. Patients are ready for the advances, and part of that is because the alternative before, wasn't really great, wasn't really patient friendly.
Although the other side of adoption, I think, is also a challenge, especially when we don't put the user in the center. So yesterday's keynote speaker talked about it's really about customer focus, customer experience. It's not the algorithm, and I'm completely in that camp. Because as we build solutions, you'll be surprised how humans just stick to their old behavior, even if they know there's a long-term benefit. So this speaks to some of the solutions internally that we want to increase the productivity of the workforce, but there is a change curve that they have to go through, and that adoption is hard.
Yep, and I actually want to piggyback right off that because there's a few use cases that we have done where we actually work on compliance optimizing, and AI/ML can really come in there because it can identify executionable insights where a single call to a patient or the physician can sort of prevent someone from dropping down, right? And especially in long term, because if it's not immediate, there's always compliance problems that we see. So definitely a place where AI should be plugging in.
We have time for one last question.
Directly related to that, I mean, ultimately what you're looking for is some kind of protocol that works, right? And so doctors have to understand the protocol, and they have to be able to apply the protocol. And really, there's a huge opportunity in the emerging wearable space, because what you want to be able, what you can do with wearables, something you couldn't do before, and certainly AI gives you the opportunity now, is to associate measurable conditions in real time with the protocol, right? I mean, are they sleeping? What happens if they take the drug? What happens if they're asleep? And like these wearables, and this is my product, I have a product called Health Gauge, and we give all this data to doctors so they can look at it. But you could use this kind of thing. See, are my patients losing sleep because they take, or are they exercising less? Are they exercising more? What's happened to their heart rate? What's happened to their heart rate variability or their blood pressure? And these wearables give you tons and tons of data that can completely change how you think about your drug in practice. And are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So we're out of time, but I think we can end this with you brought up a good point that we can end with, which is there's a lot of untapped data sources that would really change how we do drug discovery and bring the right drug to the right patients, with wearable data being one of your example. And we can wrap it up with data is the fuel for AI, and the future of AI really depends on our knowledge and understanding of how we should use the data for the right purpose, for the right business problems that we can solve. So with this, thank you again for attending this panel session. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the day.